Hello. Hello. Uh, can you hear me? Hello. Hello. Okay. Hi. So, shall I begin? My name is Parvati, and I'm going to talk to you about a book that I wrote on Jahangir. Um, I wrote this book about a year and a half, 2 years ago, and at that time, thinking back to that time now, from our current troubles, it seems like both that time and Jahangir and the Mughals are all very, very far away and very distant, and may not really even mean anything at a time when the world is dealing with so many different kinds of crises. Uh, but I remember when I was uh, reading about Jahangir and writing about Jahangir, I found him to be such an interesting character and such an enjoyable person that I would forget about everything else. So perhaps maybe today we can try uh, talking about him a little bit and maybe try and forget about Corona for maybe 40 minutes or an hour. I'm going to talk. I thought instead of seeing my face, I would like to show you some of the images and paintings from Jahangir's time. So that's what I'm going to do. If you can't hear me, just please comment on the thing. I can see the comments, and then after that, once the slideshow is over, then I'll have to shut it off and start again in case any of you have any questions. So then let me begin at the beginning. I hope you can see the painting there. This is a painting of the birth of Jahangir. If you look in the center, there's his mother, and there's another, and one of her attendants is there with her, sitting at her feet. She's holding a baby, and that is supposed to be the baby Jahangir. He was born in the monsoon in August of 1569, and you can see below there's a lot of celebration. A lot of musicians are gathered. On top, also the women are singing and playing drums. And you can see that it was a very, very joyous occasion, and of course it was a joyous occasion because this was Akbar's first son, and many people know this story, right? That Akbar wanted a child, and also more importantly, he wanted an heir, but he had no children. He had in fact had a pair of twins, Hassan and Hussein, some years previously, but they had died within 1 month of being born. And now he was almost 30, and he was getting quite desperate about whether he would ever have a child or an heir. And he would pray wherever he could. He would ask people to pray for him. And then famously, he went to Sheikh Salim Chishti, who lived nearby in Fatehpur, in Sikri, which was near Agra. And he asked him. He said, "Will I ever have a son?" And Sheikh Salim said to him, "You will have 3 sons." And indeed, soon after, Akbar's Rajput queen Harkabai, she became pregnant, and she gave birth to a child who was named Salim. in honor of the Sheikh. And this is a fairly well known story. Less well known is the story of how the Sheikh was responsible for Jahangir's birth, but Jahangir was, in a sense, responsible for the Sheikh's death. And that story goes that soon after Jahangir or Salim was born, Akbar went to visit the Sheikh and he had the baby with him. And he said to him, he said, how long? He said, in fact, he said, when will you die? And it's a very strange question, very rude question to ask somebody, but Akbar was emperor of the world, so he could ask anybody whatever he wanted. So he did, and Sheikh Salim Chishti, first he tried to avoid the question, then he said, okay, when this child that you are carrying, that is the baby Salim, when he learns something by heart and he speaks it aloud, that is when I will pass from this world. So of course, then this great order was given that nobody is to teach Salim anything. He must never learn anything by heart. And then, as happens in fairy tales, the inevitable happened. One time, Salim was alone in the nursery. One of his nurses came. She tried to play with him. She started reciting some verse to him. It was the opening lines of a famous epic poem, Yusuf and Zulaikha. And this child, he was just under 3 years old, and he learnt it up, and he went running to his tutor, and he spoke this couplet, and the tutor panicked, and he went running to Akbar, and Akbar panicked, and Akbar sent messengers to find out, is the Sheikh okay, is he okay? And of course, Sheikh Salim Chishti had fallen ill. This is a story. I'm just going to change the image. I hope the image has changed for you also. This is a story that Jahangir tells in the Jahangir Nama, which is this is a much later copy of the Jahangir Nama, but basically it's Jahangir's diary stroke autobiography, and it's a wonderful book, and I recommend it to everybody who to read, because it's very enjoyable, very easy to read, full of little anecdotes about his life and his times. And the Jahangir Nama is often understood in two different ways. People say, on the one hand, people say that it is just a record of a wealthy, powerful man's pleasures. The things he enjoyed, the interesting things that happened to him in his life. That's all, just anecdotes. On the other hand, there is a scholar called Corinne Lefebvre, a French scholar, who has recently re-examined Jahangir and the Jahangir Nama, and she says, and I quote, she says, it is a model of imperial propaganda, in the sense that Jahangir, whatever he is writing, he means to write it, and he's writing it in order to convey a certain impression of himself. So even the story of the dying, of the passing of Sheikh Salim Chishti, you can see it in two different ways. You can see it as, okay, Jahangir is just telling a story, some interesting thing that happened to him in his life, or you can see it as Jahangir trying to tell us, because what happens at the end of that story is that so when the Sheikh Salim Chishti falls ill, and Akbar goes to visit him on his deathbed, and he takes Salim, the baby, with him, and he's sitting with the Sheikh and just saying goodbye to him. And the Sheikh takes off his turban and he puts it on the baby Salim's head, and he says, "This is my true heir." So in a sense, you can say that perhaps Jahangir is trying to convey that he is not only the emperor of the world, not only does he have temporal power over the world, but he is also a spiritual authority, that he also has spiritual power over his subject. So in this way, it's possible to see Jahangir Nama in many ways, and of course it's possible to see Jahangir's life in many ways. One of the relationships in his life that is most open to interpretation is with his father. I've just changed it. This is a painting that was made during Jahangir's time. This is Jahangir, and he's holding a portrait, and he's looking at Akbar. And for much of their life, actually, I think there's a very poignant and moving portrait. For much of their life, Jahangir and his father were sort of looking at each other in this way, trying to basically size each other up. On the one hand, Jahangir was really or literally a boon that Akbar had asked for. He was desperate for children. He was desperate for an heir. This holy man, the Sufi saint, had said that you will have three sons. The first of them was Salim. His birth was celebrated, massive celebrations across the kingdom. And yet, as the years went by, it became more and more clear that Akbar was becoming increasingly disappointed and unhappy with his son. And this disappointment and unhappiness went to the extent that by the end of Akbar's reign, it was being speculated that Akbar was actually favoring Jahangir's son, that is Akbar's grandson, who's called Khusro, to be the emperor in Jahangir's place. That he didn't want Jahangir to be the new emperor. And you can see in this new picture that I've put up, Jahangir is seated, and the young man in the yellow robe who's serving him something to drink, that is his eldest son, Khusro. And Khusro was about 17 years or so when Akbar was dying and Jahangir was becoming king, and there was a great deal of politics at that time about who would. I mean, it was all very much, the balls were in the air. It was very much in the balance. Would Jahangir actually become the king, or would Khusro take over the place of his own father, because Akbar, the grandfather, preferred him. But anyway, as it happened, it was Jahangir who became king. But this idea that Jahangir was not worthy of kingship, this idea did not die with Akbar. So I'll show you this next image. This is an image that is made after Jahangir's death, in the reign of Jahangir's own son, that is Shah Jahan. And if you look at it, in the center you have Akbar seated, and to Akbar's left is Shah Jahan, and to his right is Jahangir in the red. And Akbar is taking a crown and he is handing it to Shah Jahan, while poor Jahangir is just looking on, wondering, what is going on. And so this idea that Jahangir was not really a worthy successor, that he is kind of a blip, in the history of the great early Mughals, that he's an aberration. This survives. This begins with Akbar, and it survives after Jahangir's own death. And the fact is, it is true that Jahangir was not an emperor in the way emperors may be supposed to be. He was, for example, not interested so much in conquest. He was not interested in expanding his empire. He was interested more in the sort of pleasurable alternative to warfare, that is hunting. I hope you can see this next image that I've put up. This is an image of Jahangir at a hunt. You can see he's just killed a lion. At his feet there are 4 rhinos that he's also killed. Behind him there's some deer that are being hunted. There's a cheetah that is catching a deer. Hunting with cheetahs was a favorite pastime of Akbar and then of his descendants. And Jahangir was not only fond of hunting, he was also fond of numbers. So he liked to, count things. He liked to measure things. If he ate a very big peach, he would have it measured. The date on which he had the last mango of the year, he would record that date. So one day he ordered a census of how many animals he's killed. And it was discovered that between the age of 12, when he started hunting, and the age of 50, when he ordered the census, Jahangir had, by his own hand, killed 17,167 animals. And that is a sort of obscene and horrifying number, I know, but it makes me feel better always, and I hope it will make you feel better also to know that of that 17,167, 10,000 animals were pigeons, and uh, lions were a far more modest 86. But anyway, he was not, he enjoyed hunting. He was there, he enjoyed the pleasures of life. He was not, he was also a man who, it's not that he just wanted to kill animals, he was also enjoyed having them portrayed. And in fact, he enjoyed having many things portrayed. So in his Jahangir Nama, one of the recurring phrases is, I summoned the painters. And whenever he thought that some scene should be preserved in art, he would summon the painters and they would make a drawing of it for him. So, for example, there's this beautiful, exquisite elephant. You can see the elephant almost seems to be smiling. He was captured during a battle with the Rana of Mewar, Rana Amar Singh. You can see how beautifully he's dressed also, all the sort of gold chains with which he's bound. Or for example, you could see this beautiful bird. This was captured during a hunt, and Jahangir thought it was so beautiful that he had it painted. There is also this is a less beautiful bird, the one in the center. That is the dodo, and the dodo. This is not just interesting for the art, but also because this is the only image of a dodo painted from real life that exists in the world today, and it was made in Jahangir's court by one of his painters. And the reason that the dodo arrived in Jahangir's court was because his curiosity about the world was well known. So people who came to Hindustan, to his court, would bring things with him, or people would, import interesting animals, interesting things for Jahangir to see. So, for example, along with the dodo, at another time, this animal also arrived. This is the zebra. It was brought from East Africa for Jahangir's pleasure. Jahangir prided himself on his sort of skeptical nature. He prided himself on his rationality. So when the zebra first came, he refused to believe that it was that it could be that he thought it was a horse and somebody had painted stripes on the horse just to impress him. So his attendants were sent to try and rub off the black stripes. But when they didn't manage, and then Jahangir was convinced that yes, in fact, it was a real animal that had stripes, and then he had it painted. But my favorite painting from Jahangir's time is this one. This is a painting of Inayat Khan. Inayat Khan was a nobleman in Jahangir's court. And one day he came to him and he said, I'm very ill, I'm not feeling well, I would like leave, I want to go home. And Jahangir took one look at him and he said, yes, I can see that you are not well and you must go home. And so you take leave, and here's some money. He gave him, I think, maybe 1,000 rupees or something. He said you go. But before that, he said he summoned the painters, and he told Inayat Khan to lie down and pose, and he wanted the painters to paint him. And he writes in the Jahangir Nama why he did this. He says, because when painters try to depict death or illness, they never get it right. And I want to have a depiction of what death looks like. And I find this painting fascinating for many reasons. One, of course, is just the fact that it does, in a way, depict death. If you look at it, this is an image of a man who is on the verge of dying, and he did. In fact, Inayat Khan died a day or two after this painting was made. And there's something amazingly ruthless about the action of Jahangir to see this man who is uh, clearly about to depart the world, and to think, well, okay, let me have him painted. There's something, that the ruthlessness of kings and the ruthlessness of artists that is sort of combined in this order of his. But also, I find it interesting because it undercuts the idea of Jahangir as a man who is only interested in pretty pictures, or pretty things, or pleasurable things, or only an aesthete. Because there's nothing pretty about this picture. There's nothing pleasing about it. In fact, it's scary almost in its starkness. And in a sense, perhaps it suggests that what Jahangir was doing when he was, writing his Jahangir Nama, when he was collecting, making, ordering the census of how many animals he's killed, when he was ordering his painters to depict animals or death, he was gathering information about the world as a way of knowing it better and then ruling it better. And this has a particular resonance now, I think, because for now particularly, and even for the last few years, there's been a great deal of talk about data and the accumulation of data, right? And large corporations, large governments collect data as a way of understanding large populations, and then effectively or not, or sort of malignantly governing them. And in a sense, that seems to be what Jahangir is also trying to do: collect as much information as he can find, whether it's about the dodo, or it's about death, as a way of understanding the world that is his to rule. But anyway, coming back to Inayat Khan, it's not clear what he died of. He was very, very ill, and there's some speculation that it might have been some form of TB or maybe some form of cancer. What Jahangir tells us is that he used to drink a lot, and this was not uncommon in those times. Jahangir himself drank a lot. And many people in that time would die of drinking. Jahangir's two brothers, Murad and Danial, both died of drink while Akbar was still alive, and Jahangir came very close to dying of drink himself. And this story he tells also in the Jahangir Nama. He talks about how when he was a prince, he used to drink 20 cups of hard liquor in a day. 14 during the daytime, and the remainder 6 at night. And this is an image of one of his drinking goblets. It's made of jade. Jahangir would said that at one point he was drinking so much that his hands were trembling, and his hands were trembling so much he couldn't even hold a goblet, perhaps a goblet like this one, perhaps this exact goblet. He couldn't hold it. Somebody else would have to pour the wine down his throat. And somehow, in this state, Jahangir had woke up one day with some kind of wits about him, and he called the doctor. And the doctor came. His name was Hakim Humang. The doctor came, and he said to Jahangir, he said, if you continue like this, you will be dead in 6 months. Now, it's a miracle really that Jahangir listened to him. Even more of a miracle that he was able to do something about it. But he did, and he details his very strict de-addiction program that he embarked on from that day onwards. For example, and it's a very impressive de-addiction program also. So he used to drink hard liquor. So then Jahangir started diluting his hard liquor with wine to make it less potent. He started substituting some of his drink with opium. He managed slowly to reduce his drinking until he wasn't drinking during the day at all. He was only drinking his 5 or 6 cups in the evening. And somehow, instead of dying in 6 months, he managed to live on for several more decades. And Jahangir tells this story, and he's not in any way embarrassed or ashamed of his drinking. He tells it as a perfectly regular, normal story. And in fact, there were even coins that were made. As you can see, I've just put up this picture. Coins that were minted during Jahangir's reign that show the emperor drinking from his wine cup. And again, with many things, like with many things in Jahangir's life, there are different ways of looking at his drinking. The way that it's normally understood, Jahangir was a dissolute drunkard, incapable, never sober, hardly in any position to rule, right? And that is the more common sort of impression that there is of Jahangir. But there is another way of looking at it, and this was suggested to me by a historian called Anubhuti Maurya, who's also a friend. And I was discussing this with her about Jahangir's drunkenness, and I was saying to her that he couldn't really have done much, given how he hardly ever drew a sober breath in his life. And she said, well, if you think, you can think about it in different ways. You can also think about it as Jahangir's affability. Because after all, when Jahangir did not drink alone, he wasn't sitting in some dark corner of the Agra fort and drinking all alone, crying into his cups. He would drink in company. He would drink with all the nobility around him. They would be discussing anything from religion to administration. And it was a way of binding people to him, in this sort of cheerful, friendly atmosphere of a drinking party. And amongst the people that Jahangir spoke to, this man. I hope the image has changed. This is a man called Sir Thomas Roe. Sir Thomas Roe was the first English ambassador who came to a Mughal court. He came from the court of King James I, and he came as a representative of the East India Company. And his idea was, he came with two missions basically. One was to negotiate with the Mughals for trading concessions for the East India Company, and the second was his own sort of personal agenda, was to sort of manufacture and then maintain an equivalence between the court of King James I and the court of Jahangir. And this was, obviously a doomed enterprise, because at the time, both the economic and the power balance of the world was almost exactly the opposite of what it is now. So all the wealth and all the power was concentrated in the east, and Jahangir had barely, had the Mughals generally had very little interest in this King James I and his little country, and there was nothing really that England produced that anyone here was interested in. So it was just a sort of curiosity more than anything else. So this was a difficult task for Thomas Roe to convince Jahangir and his officials that he was an important man, but this did not stop him from trying. One of my favorite stories about Sir Thomas Roe is how, when he came, he arrived in Gujarat by ship, of course, and then he was on his way. At that time, Jahangir was in Ajmer, so he was on his way to Ajmer. On the way, he went through Burhanpur. Burhanpur was an important sort of headquarters of the Mughals at the time, and it was the governor there was one of Jahangir's sons, a man called Parvez. So when Thomas Roe went through Burhanpur, naturally he would call upon Parvez. And the way that these things were done at the time was that the king or his deputy would sit under a canopy, and he would sit slightly, like 3 steps. He would sit on a platform which would be 3 steps above the ground, and the person who would come to meet him would stand on the ground, so he would be 3 steps below. Now Thomas Roe arrived, and he was standing before Parvez, and then he said, I want to come up those 3 steps and stand on the platform that you are sitting on. So Parvez was very confused, and he said, listen, if you were the Shah of Iran or if you were the Sultan of Turkey, you would not be allowed to come up these 3 steps, so please, you say what you have to say to me from there. So then Thomas Roe said, okay, then I want a chair, I want to sit. So again, Parvez said, listen, it's not possible, you can't sit in front of me, nobody is allowed, only I'm allowed to sit. So finally this went on for a while, and finally they worked out a compromise, and the compromise was that Parvez was sitting under this canopy, and it was supported by 4 silver pillars. So the compromise was that Thomas Roe was allowed to lean against one of the silver pillars and talk to Parvez in this way. And this way, so he was quite literally, he stood on his dignity and he managed to make his point. And this is Parvez that we are talking about. Parvez is one of the biggest, the most complete non-entities in Mughal history. He really hardly figures even in his own life. Jahangir was a different kettle of fish altogether. This is Jahangir. This is a painting that is made during his life. It is life-sized also. It is 6 feet tall, and it is painted with pure gold. And you can, it's sort of the power of the man and the emperor and his position and his empire just radiates from it, as if it were a 1,000-watt bulb. And this is the man that Thomas Roe went to meet and tried to sort of show his authority to. But as it happens, Jahangir was a very affable man. So Thomas Roe, he's written this, these journals about his time here. And Thomas Roe speaks very well of Jahangir. He really enjoyed him. He comes across as a very affable, very friendly, a very curious person. They have long conversations about all kinds of things, from the kind of dogs that there are in England to the kind of alcohol that they drink. Jahangir has never heard of beer, so Thomas Roe tells him all about beer and how it's made. And all the while, Thomas Roe is telling these stories, and he's trying to make it seem that he and Jahangir are sort of great buddies, and he never wants to show that. He doesn't want to really concede the power that Jahangir has, and yet sometimes a few things slip through. And for me, one of the most evocative images that slips through in Thomas Roe's book is. He describes how he has these evening sessions where he's drinking and talking and discussing with his nobility, and then he says at some point it could happen, if once he'd had perhaps too much to drink, that Jahangir would just fall asleep. And he said the minute the emperor fell asleep, all the candles in the room were popped out, he says, and all the courtiers, in his words, were blindfold dismissed. So immediately, the minute the king closes his eyes, in that sense, is when darkness falls, and all the courtiers have to feel their way out, blindfold, unable to see in the dark. And in a sense, that sort of captures the sheer enormity of the power that Jahangir has, and. But again, one can see, this is of course how Roe sees him. How does Jahangir see himself? There are many paintings of Jahangir from Jahangir's time that are of course of animals and other curiosities. There are many also of the emperor himself. And this one is a very famous one. It's in Delhi in the National Museum. It's of Jahangir looking at a portrait of the Madonna. Jahangir's fascination with Christian art and iconography was very well known. And less well known is how Jahangir thought of, after he was Akbar's son, and one of the iconic phrases from the rule of Akbar is Sulekul, peace for all, which is the principle on which Akbar bound the many different types of people, many different religions, sects, creeds that existed in his increasing empire together by promising that everyone will be at peace with each other under his rule. Jahangir refers to himself as Mazar-e-Kul, which translates roughly to the universal manifestation, and he interprets it seems to mean that he will provide for and he will protect all people of all faiths and sects and creeds in his empire. And of course this sometimes works better in theory than in practice. There is most famously the story of Guru Arjan Dev's execution. Guru Arjan Dev was executed by Jahangir because he had helped. So if you remember Khusro, who we talked about in the beginning, Khusro was Jahangir's eldest son, and he had been propped up by Akbar and various other courtiers in the Mughal court to think that he could be the new emperor. So when Jahangir became emperor instead, he was, of course, he was 17 years old. He was not at all happy, and within 6 months or so of Jahangir's coronation, Khusro had rebelled against him, and he had launched a war basically against him. And on his during his rebellion, he had visited Guru Arjan Dev. And Guru Arjan Dev, who had had a good relationship with Khosrow's grandfather, that is Akbar, had, it seems, blessed him. He may even have given him some money, it's not clear. But he had given him his blessing. And later on, when Jahangir was told about this, he was very upset, and he had him executed. This is a very well-known story. Less well-known story is the story of a Shia cleric in Jahangir's court called Nurullah Shushtari. There's a scholar called Sajjad Rizvi who's written a fascinating essay about this Shushtari. Shushtari was at one point whipped. It's not clear why he was whipped, and then he died. He was an old man, and he died. Now, there are various theories about why he was whipped, and one is that being Shia in a court which was becoming increasingly Sunni and increasingly conservative, as a reaction, in fact, to Akbar's great liberalism that many people in court had not been happy with. Under Jahangir, there was a sort of conservative faction was trying to take over. And so Shushtari felt that he should hide his Shia identity, and this was discovered by Jahangir, and Jahangir was very upset, not because Shushtari was Shia, but because he was pretending not to be. And by pretending not to be, he was casting a shadow on the idea of Jahangir as Mazhar-e-Kul, as somebody who is everybody's protector. So he had Shushtari whipped. But, of course, this story doesn't end there, because it's also possible, as Sajjad Rizvi explains in his essay, it's also possible to interpret the whole situation as being one in which Shushtari is not the one who's pretending, that in fact Jahangir was pressurized by the Sunni faction that wasn't happy with Shushtari to have him whipped, and in fact it is Jahangir who is pretending that he doesn't know what's going on, as a way of pretending to himself that he's still in control, or still a liberal, when in fact he is being pressurized by this faction in his court to do something that he himself possibly may not want to do. And to add another layer of complication to all this, if we go back to the Jahangir Nama and you look for perhaps a recurring spiritual thread that runs through it, you see that this is a Hindu Brahmin ascetic called Jadru Gosen, whom Jahangir visits and talks about several times in the Jahangir Nama. You can see him here. He meets him always alone. So as you see, here he's talking to Jadru Gosen, and all the courtiers are well away from them behind the trees, and he spends hours with him, and he has long conversations. And after that, he comes and he says, he says in so many words, he says that I didn't want to leave him, and he seems to be deriving a real sort of spiritual solace from his company with Jadru Gosen. And to add another layer even to that is this painting, which is quite a fascinating painting, in which this is Jahangir sitting in the pose that could well be that of Jadru Gosen's himself. He's sitting in the pose of a Hindu ascetic. With him, possibly, is the other great mystery of Jahangir's life, and that is Noor Jahan, his last wife. And in the way again that she is understood, and their relationship is understood, Jahangir is thought to be a man who was a drunkard, dissolute, aesthete, only interested in pleasure, and Noor Jahan was the one who took the reign of power from him and actually controlled the empire, right? And to sort of hammer home this idea, this painting again, it's made much later. It's made much later in during, in fact, Shah Jahan's time. And there's Noor Jahan, and there's Jahangir, and he's looking quite sort of besotted and in love, and they're having a drinking party. And this is this idea of Jahangir just sitting with the women, enjoying himself, leaving the empire to run itself, is fairly common and widespread. But again, and it is the same scholar that I mentioned earlier, Corinne Lefebvre, who says, well, why do we have this impression, right? And she says this impression comes to us from basically from two sources. One of them is Thomas Roe. Thomas Roe came from the East India Company, like I said, looking for trade concessions. He spent about 4 years negotiating very hard for them, and he got nothing for all his troubles. He had to go back empty-handed. And of course, then he had to explain to the East India Company, the board of directors, why he had come back with nothing. They had spent so much money sending him, keeping him here, and he managed to achieve nothing. And the fact is that Jahangir was very nice to him, and he does possibly want to indicate that he, as an ambassador, was successful. He was able to spend so much time with Jahangir in his company, entertaining him and being entertained by him, and yet he was not able to get what he wanted. And why? So then he says, because he is controlled by his wife. And of course, I, as Thomas Roe, as a man, and that to a foreign man, I cannot have access to Noor Jahan. Therefore, I was unable to negotiate, and Jahangir himself is just a weak man. I became as friendly as I could with him, but what could I do in the end? The second source for this idea of Jahangir as a man who is completely controlled by his wife is his son. And this is not Khusro, this is his fourth son who became emperor after him, that is Shah Jahan. And Shah Jahan, in the last few years of his life, had rebelled against Jahangir. And when Jahangir died, Shah Jahan became king. Noor Jahan did not die at the same time. She remained alive 20 years after Jahangir's passing. But Shah Jahan was so wary of her that he kept her in house arrest in Lahore for 20 years after Jahangir had died. And he tried to, erase every trace of her. She had minted coins in her own name, which Shah Jahan had melted and destroyed. It is historians writing during Shah Jahan's time who have Jahangir create this idea of Jahangir as this man who is completely subjugated by his wife, that he is only interested in eating and drinking, and he himself says, I leave the government to Noor Jahan. But since then, particularly now in the recent past, there's been a lot of re-examination of their relationship. A historian called Ruby Lal brought out a book a year or so ago, in which, in fact, she calls, it's called Empress, and she calls Noor Jahan co-sovereign, who ruled the emperor not instead of Jahangir, but with him. And there is certainly something in the little traces here and there that you can see of their relationship. There is a very sort of lovely sense of mutual respect and mutual affection that comes through. So Noor Jahan was Jahangir's 20th, 21st wife. Noor Jahan herself had been married before. Jahangir was her second husband, and they seem to have shared many common interests, from hunting to painting to also, of course, wine parties, and they seem to have and it seems as if Jahangir was a man who was willing, in fact, not that she took over the reins from him, but that he was willing to share the reins with her, because he realized that this was an intelligent woman, and she was a good administrator, and he was happy to take her help in a way, and acknowledge it, in fact, in a way that even now it would be difficult to imagine too many powerful husbands, letting their or having their wives have an equal share in power uh, with them. So with that, I will end talking. I don't know if you have any questions. I will be happy to answer them. And I will try and put this off and see